kind of war fighting could also be privatized and outsourced. And he made this very clear. This was really his mission of transformation, which I think is really not understood how radical it was. You know, we hear this phrase, you know, we hear Bush praising Rumsfeld for his radical vision of transformation of the military. And it's all these sort of buzzwords that are hard to understand. But if we look at what Rumsfeld's record was, it was that, you know, I write in the book that really what he did is, you know, this is somebody who after he left the Ford administration, spent a couple of decades working in business and really saw himself as a man of the new economy. And, you know, this is somewhere where I think that the research I did for No Logo really intersects with this disaster capitalism stage that we're in right now. Because Rumsfeld took the 1990s revolution in branding, in corporate branding, where, and this is what I wrote about in No Logo, where you had all of these companies that used to produce products, announcing with great fanfare that they don't produce products anymore, they produce brands, they produce images, and they can let other people, sort of lesser contractors, do the dirty work of actually making stuff. And that was the sort of revolution in outsourcing, and that was the paradigm of the hollow corporation. Rumsfeld very much comes out of that tradition, and when he came on board as defense secretary, he wrote in like a new economy CEO that was going to do one of these radical restructurings. But what he was doing is he was taking this philosophy of this revolution in the corporate world and applying it to the military. And what he oversaw was the hollowing out of the American military, where essentially the role of the Army is branding, is marketing, is projecting the image of strength and dominance on the globe, and then but outsourcing every function, from healthcare, providing healthcare to soldiers, to the building of military bases, which was already happening under the Clinton administration, to the extraordinary role that Blackwater has played, and companies like it, like DynCorp, where we've, you know, as Jeremy has reported, they're actually engaged in combat. And in fact, Blackwater working with Pinochet's soldiers, but in Iraq. Yeah, and I mean, this is, we see these layers of continuity. I mean, Paul Bremer was the assistant to Kissinger during the Nixon administration when the support for Pinochet was so strong. So you have all of these layers of historical continuity, and you know that's why I guess my motivation for writing the book was. There has been no accountability for these crimes. In Latin America, there have been truth commissions, there have been trials. The people who were at the heart of this very violent transformation, many of them have actually been held accountable. Not all of them have, but many of them have actually been held accountable. If not in the courts, then certainly in a deep and important public discussion of truth and reconciliation. But this country, that has never happened, despite the fact that there's been a great deal of wonderful investigative reporting. And because there's never been any accountability, the same players are really at it again. Talk about, Naomi Klein, the destruction of Iraq. Talk about shock and awe, the shock economic therapy of Paul Bremer, the shock of torture as well, putting them all together in Iraq. Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, you know, in Chile, we see this triple shock formula and torture as an enforcement of these policies. And I think we see the same triple shock formula in Iraq. The first was the invasion, the shock and awe military invasion of Iraq. And if you read the manual, the military manual that explained the theory of shock and awe, a lot of people think of it as just like a lot of bombs, a lot of missiles. But it's really a psychological doctrine, which in itself is a war crime, because it says very bluntly that during the first Gulf War, the goal was to attack Saddam's military infrastructure. But under a shock and awe campaign, the target is the society writ large. That's a quote from the shock and awe doctrine. Now, targeting societies writ large is collective punishment, which is a war crime. Militaries are not allowed to target societies writ large. They're only allowed to target military. So this was the doctrine is actually quite amazing, because it talks about sensory deprivation on a mass scale. It talks about blinding, cutting off the senses of a whole population. And we saw that during the invasion, of the lights going out. the cutting off of all communication, and the phones going out. And then the looting, which, I don't actually believe was part of the strategy, but I think doing nothing in some ways was part of the strategy, because of course we know that there were all kinds of warnings that the museums and libraries needed to be protected, and no action was taken. And then you had the famous statement from Donald Rumsfeld when he was confronted with this: stuff happens. So it was, I think, it was this idea that because the goal was, in New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman's famous phrase, not nation building, but nation creating, which is an extraordinarily violent idea if you stop and think about what it means to create a nation in a nation that already exists. Something has to happen to the nation that was already there. And we're talking about a culture as old as civilization. So I think that because there was this idea that we were starting from scratch, and this idea that is often portrayed, in the U.S. media as idealistic, of wanting to build a model nation in the heart of the Arab world that would spread, to neighboring countries and lead to an opening up. This idea of building a model nation is, it has all kinds of colonial echoes. It really can't be done without some kind of a cleansing. And so I think that the ease, the comfort level with the looting, with the erasing of Iraq's history, has to be seen within that vision of, okay, well, we're starting over from scratch. So anything that's already there is really just getting in the way. So if it's loaded onto trucks and sold in Syria and Jordan, that sort of just makes the job easier. And so I think we saw that on many, many levels.
Naomi Klein, how does Abu Ghraib fit into this picture?
Well, I quote Richard Armitage in the book saying that the theory, the working theory in Iraq, was that Iraqis would be so disoriented by the war and by the fall of Saddam that they would be easily marshaled from point A to point B. Now, as we know, that was not the case. And as when Paul Bremer rode in and did his radical country makeover, fired the entire much of the Iraqi civil service as well as the army, declared Iraq open for business, cheap imports flooded the country, Iraqi businesses couldn't compete. That first summer, there was a huge amount of peaceful protest outside the Green Zone. And it became clear that it was just simply not going to be possible to marshal Iraqis from point A to point B. And it was after that, when the first armed resistance emerged in Iraq, that the war was brought to the prisons. And this also comes back to Donald Rumsfeld's vision of being the sort of CEO defense secretary, because, of course, like any CEO, he understaffed the war. And he was not in a position, or the U.S. occupying force was not in a position to deal with this drastic miscalculation and this sort of fantasy that Iraqis would just behave and accept this economic shock therapy and really this looting of their country. So when Iraqis began to resist, the suppression of that resistance couldn't take place in the streets because there simply wasn't the person power. So people were rounded up and brought to the jails, and torture was used, as it was in Latin America, to send a message to the entire country. And torture is always, it's both private and public at the same time. And this is true no matter who is using it, that for torture to work as a tool of state terror, it's not just about what happens between an interrogator and a prisoner. It's also about sending a message to the broader society: this is what happens if you step out of line. And I believe torture was used by the U.S. occupation in that way, not just to get information, but also as a warning to the country.
Naomi, I want to end this part of our conversation by taking a reverse trip. President Bush just went from the Bayou, from New Orleans to Baghdad. Let's go back. Both you and I were just in New Orleans. I saw you last 2 years ago in New Orleans as well, just after the hurricane. Fit Katrina and the U.S. response to the drowning of the American city into this picture.
Well, New Orleans is a classic example of what I'm calling the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, because you had that first shock, which was the drowning of the city. And as you know, having just returned from New Orleans, this was not a natural disaster. I mean, the great irony here is that it really was a disaster of this very ideology that we're talking about, the systematic neglect of the public sphere. And I think increasingly we're going to see this, where you have 25 years of steady neglect of the public infrastructure and the bones of the state. The transportation system, the roads, the levees are weak and frail. And the American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated that it would take $1.5 trillion to bring the bones of the state up to standard because they're so weakened, the bridges and the roads and the levees. And so what we have is a kind of a perfect storm where the weakened, frail state is intersecting with increasingly heavy weather, which I would argue is also part of this same ideological frenzy for short-term profit and short-term growth. And when these two collide, you have a disaster. And that's what happened in New Orleans. The frail levees intersected with heavy weather, although not even that heavy weather, that the Category 5 hurricane didn't actually hit. And I think, you know, just as an aside, since we're in New York, that another really powerful example of exactly that happened this summer when the subways flooded. Everyone was shocked because it didn't rain that hard, but the infrastructure was so weakened because of this steady neglect. And what was the headline in the New York Sun? Sell the subways. So first, the ideology weakens, creates the disaster, and then it's used as an excuse to finish the job, to privatize everything. And that is what happened in New Orleans. Immediately after the city flooded, you had this ideological campaign, ground zero of which was the Heritage Foundation in Washington, which has always been, I guess, the most powerful engine for this radical free market vision, announcing that, you know, this is a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity to completely remake the state, i.e. eliminate it. So an explosion of charter schools. The public schools were not reopened. They were converted to charter schools. The public hospital, like Charity Hospital, remains boarded up. The public housing, and this is the most dramatic example, that horrible quote from a Republican congressperson, we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did it 10 days after the levees broke. This is what I mean by the shock doctrine, this idea of harnessing a disaster to push through radical privatization.
Naomi, as we wrap up this hour, what were you most shocked by in researching the shock doctrine?
I was shocked that there is this cache of literature out there, which I didn't know existed, where the economists admit it. And this is what I guess I'm most excited about in the book, is how many quotes I have from very high-level advocates of free market economics, everyone from Milton Friedman to John Williamson, who's the man who coined the phrase, the Washington Consensus, admitting amongst themselves, not publicly, but amongst themselves, in sort of technocratic documents, that they have never been able to push through a radical free market makeover in the absence of a large-scale crisis, i.e. the central myth of our time, that democracy and capitalism go hand in hand, is known to be a lie by the very people who are advancing it, and they will admit it on the record.
Well, folks, there is more to come. We will continue this conversation afterwards and bring it to you on a later broadcast. Naomi Klein, our guest in her first national broadcast interview on the release of her book today, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Tonight we'll be at the Ethical Culture Society at 2 West 64th Street in New York. Naomi will be launching her book, and you can look at her book tour at shockdoctrine.com to see where she will be in the coming months, a very extensive tour around this country. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Berkshire, Hubda Kudus, Aaron Mate, Anjali Kamet, Jeffrey Hagerman, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Carrie Mache, Mike DeFilippo, and Miguel Noguera, our engineer. Special thanks also to Becca Staley, Hugh Brand, John Randolph, Jerome Bourgeois, Kieran Krug Meadows. Our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.